The date is November 18, 1991. The location is Vukovar, a small Baroque city on the banks of the Danube. For 87 days, this town has been the meat grinder of Europe. The air isn't just cold, it's thick with the scent of pulverized brick, cordite, and rotting flesh. General Milošević stands amidst the ruins, watching the remnants of the Croatian resistance emerge from the basements. They aren't soldiers anymore, they are ghosts wrapped in rags. To his left, the Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA, sits atop a mountain of spent artillery shells. They have fired over 700,000 projectiles into a space of 4 square miles. It is the most intense bombardment in Europe since the fall of Berlin. But as the white flags rise, a chilling realization sets in. They have won the city, but they have lost the soul of their nation. Instead, as the first buses of prisoners are loaded toward the Vukovar farm, the question remains, was this the birth of a new state or the beginning of a suicide pact? The Yugoslav wars, the collapse of a nation into war. The world of 1990 was a landscape of tectonic shifts. The Berlin Wall had crumbled. The Soviet Union was gasping its final breaths. In the West, the narrative was the end of history, the triumph of liberal democracy. But in the Balkans, history was just waking up from a 40-year coma. Yugoslavia was the anomaly of the Cold War. It was a socialist state that defied Stalin, a multi-ethnic federation held together by Tito. By the late 1980s, the economic glue was failing. Hyperinflation hit 2,500%. The IMF was knocking at the door. The central government in Belgrade was hemorrhaging authority to the 6 constituent republics. The military balance was a powder keg. The JNA was the 4th largest army in Europe, designed to repel a Soviet invasion that would never come. It was a massive, modern force of 200,000 active troops and millions of reservists, equipped with thousands of M84 tanks and Soko G4 Super Galeb jets. But its officer corps was 70% Serb, while its rank and file reflected the country's diversity. The army was a weapon looking for a master, and the master it found was not a nation, but an ideology. The tragedy of Yugoslavia was driven by 3 men who understood power better than they understood their people. Slobodan Milošević, a former banker turned Serbian president, was a master of the controlled chaos strategy. He didn't seek to preserve Yugoslavia, he sought to inherit its ruins. He was a populist chameleon, trading his communist credentials for the fire of Serbian grievances. Across the border in Zagreb was Franjo Tuđman, a former JNA general turned Croatian nationalist. Tuđman was obsessed with history and maps. He viewed the borders of Croatia not as administrative lines, but as a destiny to be fulfilled. He was rigid, authoritarian, and convinced that the West would eventually bankroll his bid for independence. Then there was Alija Izetbegović in Bosnia. A scholar and a devout man, he presided over the most fragile piece of the puzzle. Bosnia was the little Yugoslavia, a tapestry of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks living in a state of brotherhood and unity that was about to evaporate. Izetbegović was caught in a strategic pincer. If he stayed in a Serb-dominated Yugoslavia, his people were sidelined. If he declared independence, he triggered a war. He had no army to fight. These 3 men were not just politicians. They were the architects of a divorce that would be settled in blood. The strategic buildup was a masterclass in deception and the slow-motion collapse of institutional loyalty. Throughout 1990, the JNA began a clandestine operation known as RAM. It was a plan to reorganize military districts to bypass Republican borders and consolidate heavy weaponry in areas with high Serb populations. While the federal government talked of reforms, the JNA was secretly arming civilian militias. They moved the territorial defense weapons meant for local resistance into federal warehouses. Geography dictated the coming slaughter. Croatia's borders were an elongated horseshoe, nearly impossible to defend without deep strategic depth. Slovenia, nestled against the Alps, was ethnically homogeneous and tucked away from the Serbian heartland effect that would make its exit brief and relatively bloodless. But Bosnia was the high ground. Its mountains and river valleys were a natural fortress, and the city of Sarajevo sat in a bowl, surrounded by hills that would soon become the most infamous sniper nests in modern history. Everything changed on June 25, 1991. Slovenia and Croatia declared independence simultaneously. In Ljubljana, the Slovenians moved with surgical precision. They seized border crossings and repainted the signs. The JNA responded by sending columns of tanks from Croatia, expecting the Apareta War to end in 48 hours. They were wrong. The Slovenians used man-portable air defense systems and light anti-tank weapons to turn the Alpine passes into choke points in Croatia. The shift was darker. The log revolution had already begun. Serb militias blocked roads with timber, cutting off the Dalmatian coast. By August, the JNA dropped the facade of neutrality. They moved into the Danube Valley. The tactical maneuver was a classic pincer movement, aimed at cutting Croatia in two, separating the capital Zagreb from the eastern plains of Slavonia. The siege of Vukovar became the template for the entire conflict. The JNA used a doctrine of total destruction. They sat back and used heavy artillery to level the city block by block before sending in infantry. It was a tactical failure masquerading as a victory. The JNA's reliance on massive firepower revealed a deeper weakness. Their infantry was demoralized. Desertion rates were skyrocketing. Reservists in Belgrade were jumping off trucks rather than heading to the front. The JNA had the steel, but they no longer had the will. By the time the Dayton Accords were signed in 1995, the numbers were staggering. Over 100,000 dead, over 2 million displaced. The economy of the region was set back 30 years. Bosnia was a patchwork of minefields and mass graves. The JNA, once the pride of the non-land movement, had ceased to exist, replaced by fractured national armies. The leadership fallout was historic. For the first time since Nuremberg, a sitting head of state Milošević could be hauled before an international tribunal for war crimes. The critical mistake of the Yugoslav wars was a fundamental miscalculation by the Serbian leadership regarding the role of the JNA. They believed that a conventional, high-intensity military force could be used to win an unconventional, ethnic territorial war. By using the national army as a blunt instrument against its own citizens, they destroyed the very legitimacy the army needed to maintain order. They focused on cleansing territory rather than securing strategic objectives. This overconfidence led to a logistical nightmare. The JNA was trying to maintain a front line that was thousands of miles long with a logistics chain that was still geared for a 1970-style Cold War defense. The legacy of the Yugoslav wars is a haunting presence in modern geopolitics. It introduced the world to the term ethnic cleansing. It forced the transformation of NATO from a defensive alliance into an interventionist force. It proved that in the post-Cold War world, the greatest threat to a nation is not an external invader, but the internal collapse of shared identity. Today, the rust-streaked skeletons of socialist monuments still dot the Balkan landscape, overlooking borders that are now lined with barbed wire and modern sensors. The military innovations were grim: the first widespread use of drones for artillery spotting in urban environments, and the terrifying efficiency of localized, decentralized paramilitary warfare. The collapse of Yugoslavia serves as a brutal reminder that a nation is not just a collection of borders and a flag. It is a fragile agreement. When that agreement fails, the descent from a modern, Olympic-hosting European state to a medieval landscape of siege and slaughter can happen in a matter of weeks. The shadows of the war still lengthen over the valleys of the Drina and the ruins of Vukovar, a silent warning that the ghosts of the past are never truly buried. They are merely waiting for the next economic crisis or the next charismatic demagogue to call them back to the front.